Okay, Eduardo, I think you can start.
Okay.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay.
Should I just start?
You can just start. Yes.
Okay. Cool.
That'd be fine.
Can you hear me properly?
We can. Yep.
Oh. So there we go. So hello, and today I'm presenting the topic that I chose, which is the human role in developing unbiased artificial intelligence systems. So first, I'll give you an outline of today's presentation. First, I'm going to go through concepts that I think are important for me to convey the ideas I want you to take home today. First, I will go through what is bias and just dig deeper into unconscious bias. Then I will go into how I define artificial intelligence. And that will take us to examples of biased artificial intelligence, where in the end, I will highlight the importance of data to avoid biased artificial intelligence. Finally, I'll conclude with proposals to minimize these biases, focusing on the data and also focusing on ourselves in humans. This is to ultimately develop more fair artificial intelligence system. Now, before moving on to
yeah. I really can't. Maybe somebody else could let you in.
Dr. Solis, maybe could you mute yourself?
I'm sorry.
So before moving to the concepts, I acknowledge that I looked into several definitions and then came up with the concepts as I am going to show them to you today. So let's begin with what is bias? And it is an error whenever an evaluator, and that can be you, me, misrepresents truth. And it happens because we favor or disfavor one group when compared to another. So if we delve a little bit more, what is unconscious bias? And this is something that humans do inherently. It's part of ourselves, and it happens when unconsciously we make quick judgments about people or situations. And this can be a consequence of our personal cultural backstory. This is a part of our decision-making process as humans. But nowadays, decision-making is not exclusive to humans. Now we share this with artificial intelligence. It's becoming more common that they can help us in coming to a decision. So that's why I think it's important for me to define artificial intelligence in the context of this presentation. I define it as a computational algorithm, an algorithm being a set of steps that simulates the human ability to make decisions in any given situation. So how are these AI systems developed? Well, let's go through that very quickly in a nutshell. Imagine that you are an AI developer. So first, you identify a problem that needs solving. Then you need to collect data that is representative and related to the problem that you think you're going to solve. Then you select or create an algorithm, again, a set of steps, that will help you solve that problem. Once you do that, you use these data in this algorithm and you challenge it. Ultimately, the question you want to answer is, How well is the problem solved? Finally, you evaluate the outcome of the AI, and you fine-tune it until it comes to a point in which it provides an appropriate solution to the problem in the first place. We can consider that an AI system is well developed when it does just that. It provides a proper solution to the problem. And I want you to keep these steps in the back of your head because we're going to revisit them a little later. The problem happens when AI replicates our human unconscious biases. Why? Because biased artificial intelligence can have real impacts in the lives of people. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples showing you just how this can happen and is already happening. So judges in the States can use software programs to predict if a criminal is likely to repeat an offense. And using this software, the judges come to a conclusion and decide what's the appropriate sentence for this individual. So the criminal sentence will be affected by the AI system, ultimately. It can be affected. There is a case in which one of these softwares used by the judicial system in the States was shown to be biased against African Americans. The company that created the software trained its program in such a way that the result was disfavorable if you were of this particular race. So that is already an impact in the lives of these individuals. Now let's move to a different example. Imagine you're a company and you receive thousands of resumes of people that want to work for you. And you're like, oh my God, how am I going to go through all of this? Well, you can develop a software that can screen all these resumes and can select or pre-select the ones that are likely to be good employees. One very notorious company was working on such a software, and it used data from its own company from the past to train their artificial intelligence system. They discovered that the system was eliminating all female candidates because the data from the past only included male individuals. So the AI considered it logical to scrape right away the female candidates. So as you can see, these are two examples where AI has the potential to impact the lives of humans. If we come back to this stream of steps to develop an AI, I want you to focus on the data. Collect data related to the problem, and then use that to train your algorithm. So it's clear that it is very important that the data is actually representing the problem. And in MIT, a group, the MIT Media Lab, wanted to prove the importance of data in training an AI system. So they created Norman. Norman was an image captioning software. What this software does is that it looks at an image and then it generates a descriptive text of the image, like these are mountains with a moon, something like that. What they did was to train Norman, here represented by an eye, with data from a website that was linked to death and dark thoughts. Then they presented Norman with an image, and sure enough, Norman generated what they describe as psychopathic descriptions of images. So they actually showed that the data used to train your algorithm is extremely important in the outcome of the entire system. And sure enough, these systems can only be as good as the data that you feed them. That's why it has to be the data representative of our reality and of the problem itself. Biased data can result in a biased artificial intelligence system, which in turn can affect the lives of people. So I propose checkpoints to mitigate, to decrease the bias in the data. There are more checkpoints for sure. These are the ones that I found could help us do that. So the first one, and I'm going to elaborate on each of these, is to avoid faulty data sampling. The second one, to be careful when we reuse old data. And the third one, to be mindful when we are collecting data for the first time. So let's go through each of these. Faulty data sampling happens when the person, imagine the AI developer, selects data that is not representing the actual problem. And let me show you in a graphic. Imagine this is the problem, and this is reality. Reality is complex, and that's why I put a lot of shapes. But as you can see, we have squares, stars, a pentagon, a triangle, a Pac-Man, and circles. Let's say that you are an AI developer and you want to solve this problem. And you select a subset of this population to study the problem and to train your AI. What's happening in here? What's happening is that there are missing elements. The star, the triangle, and the circle are not in the subset selected to train the AI. Therefore, your AI system, good as it can be, was not shown all the picture. And so it's not going to consider this whenever providing a solution. In real life, this can have very dire consequences. It can replicate the bias that we already have among humans. It can amplify the underrepresentation of certain human communities that already exist in our databases. So that's why we need to be very careful when selecting the subsets that we're going to use when training our artificial intelligence system. Now let's move towards what happens when we have all data available. So all data sets are used over and over again to study new problems. And the person, imagine the AI developer that is looking into these data sets, could give several values, different values, to the information in the data sets. It could give a higher value to a particular point and a lower value to another point. And in that way, that person is putting a bias in the way the data is being collected. If this happens, then that data that will be used to train the AI will replicate the biases in the system. So we need to be very careful of how we reuse data and also how we collect the data in the first place. But to that effect, who can make sure that we collect representative data in the first place? That we collect points in the, I don't know, information from our world that is truly representative of reality. So we are in university. Let's look at it from a university researching perspective. We publish. The academic publishers can take that role by creating better networks so that peers can evaluate the data that is being collected and even the protocols for collecting the data and identify before they finish collecting data if there are biases. Also, we could do a better job in creating repositories or places where we can access the data. Because that way, a potential peer that wants to evaluate your, samples, they can look and they could see if it is biased in the first place. And ultimately, these information is used to generate policies. So government leaders and public sector officials should get involved in proper data collection, because that way they can promote inclusion. Every member of the society would be represented in the data sets. And then these data sets can be used to train artificial intelligence systems that can help us make better decisions for our future. These are human roles. And that takes me to my next point. Humans, we have biases within ourselves. It is part of who we are. So instead of just thinking that they're not there, we should be aware of them and address them. So again, I propose 3 checkpoints to decrease bias in humans. First, to identify them, then foster diversity, and a final common sense checkpoint is to avoid mental tiredness. Now I want to go through each of them. But before doing that, why am I stepping away from AI and data and going into humans? Because I think that tackling bias in ourselves can have positive consequences. The one relevant to my topic is that these unconscious biases won't be replicated in artificial intelligence systems if the AI developers are quick to spot a bias and say, that bias, I'm not going to use it, or I'm going to correct for it. So let's move on to the checkpoints. To consciously address unconscious biases. So again, these biases they happen naturally. They are thinking shortcuts that help us process the information that we see in reality. They can have potential negative effects. One strategy is to look at it from the empathy perspective. Imagine that you're coming to a decision, and instead of saying, this will be my final decision, question yourself. Would I reach the same decision in the shoes of another person, or wouldn't I? Once you identify these potential biases, you can compensate for them. And that is easily done when we collaborate. And that takes me to my next point. Collaboration is better done when you have a diverse team, because each team member can see the problem from a different lens. imagine this is the problem. And these are team members. Both of them are looking at the problem. One of them comes with a solution. The other team member can evaluate the solution and provide insightful feedback and say, hey, that could be biased. Let's address it. So if you have the chance to be in a diverse team, you have greater chances at identifying biases that may not be obvious to you, but may be obvious to your team member. Imagine if an AI development team then is diverse, then they can identify these biases and address them. Now, my last point, it's very common sense. Rested minds can be more aware of bias. Why do I say this? Because cognition is finite in a day. We wake up, and as the day progresses, our cognition decreases because we get tired. So important decisions should be made when the mind is well rested, because that increases the chances of detecting biases. Biases between ourselves, in the case of AI development, biases in the AI training data, or in the final outcome. So, to conclude, I want you to take home that the data used to train the artificial intelligence system is extremely important. And we need to check whether the data is biased or not, because biases are part of humans, and we collected the data in the first place. It is our responsibility to record unbiased data that is truly representative of our reality. And I propose these strategies to address bias in ourselves in the first place, so that we are quick in noticing whenever there's a biased outcome or biased data. We also can evaluate how we are recording data, and we can see if we are leaving out a particular sector of the population that then should be included. We can listen to everyone. And finally, we can evaluate the data that we already have, because all of this can be used to train the AI systems that in the end will help our world. So that's my presentation, and that's that. Thank you. Any questions? Are you there?
I would have a comment.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for the presentation. I loved it. And you did a really good job. I liked the theme. I liked how did you catch up on these base of bias. And I liked how did you connect that with artificial intelligence with real examples.
Mm-hmm.
So I really don't have a question, but I really wanted to thank you.
Oh.
There. Yeah. So I have a question. Isn't it true that there can be desirable positive biases? The bias towards human life, the prejudice against cannibalism. I mean, there are all sorts of things you can think of that are a part of human beliefs, but we want them there, right? They are a bias of sorts, but they're a kind of guiding bias that hopefully all civilized humans have, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea of bias is a bit more complicated than just the negative bias. Because what about if we think that there's a clear-cut positive bias that everybody should have, but that's actually controversial and not everybody agrees, right? So yeah. So the whole situation is a little bit more complicated.
Yes, and I agree. I focused on the negative to make a point. But there was evidence in the past, and I wrote about it in my essay, in which a system that was shown to be biased was used to, the system was used to make a decision, but ultimately that was not the final decision that was taken. The system made a decision, and then humans evaluated the decision. And based on that, they came up to the final verdict, if you will. And what they found was that in comparison to institutes that did not use this AI system, they were less biased. So, these AI systems have restrictions, of course, but we should aim to develop them in such a way that they are fair and they consider the opinion of most of the population in a fair way, and then use them with us to make the final decision. And sure enough, there are biases that would be good to keep, like cannibalism, or, I don't know, something very negative that we don't want in our society. For sure, we should put that as a restriction so that it doesn't come up as the final decision, right? So yeah, you're right. But I did focus on the negatives to make a point.
I really enjoyed your presentation, Eduardo. I thought that it was really telling, especially with the examples you showed, and you really took us through each step very clearly, and I could see the natural sequence. I don't really have a question for you either, but I could ask. So you talked about AI moving towards more a human-centric approach. How do you see AI systems in the technological singularity per se?
Well, that's a good question, because I mean, if the singularity is about to happen, ultimately they will become the most intelligent being in the planet. We want to work with them. We want to collaborate with them, right? We don't want them to be like, oh, and by the way, you vermin of humanity are making things worse. So we're going. So I think that if we are able to, oh my God, that's a tough one. Because I don't know, to be honest with you, if we want to bias them actually to value life, right? So as Dr. Soleil say, right, we want them to value us rather than not. I don't know how to answer your question. That was a tough one.
So
No, that's a good response. Thanks.
there's a strange phenomenon. You probably know that a lot of tech people are becoming vegetarian or vegan exactly for this reason, that they're thinking that when AI is smarter than we are, it's not going to make much sense that we're killing animals for meat, and yet we don't want them to harm us, right? Yeah. This is prohibition against killing humans, but we're like really happy to kill animals to eat them. Yeah. And a lot of famous tech people have made this transition, and I made it too, but I have to say it's not just because of this, but because of all the young people surrounding me were, vegetarian. I felt like sort of fit in with the other people in the room, So it wasn't just that I'm afraid of what sentient AI is going to think about me. And it was very interesting, the resistance in my family, it's like, what are you doing? Now we have to plan meals differently, and yeah, it's a real pain. But they've all, accommodated and so on. And it began with a few tech leaders making this change and talking about how you cannot exactly predict, but it just seems like this is a kind of illogical side of the way humans operate at the moment. And maybe it would be better not to be on a part of that illogic, you know? So, so I mean, that's sort of looking forward to that point when AI is sort of in charge, you know, and we want to be on their good side.
Yeah.
I have a question. Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Go for it, Nicole.
So you talked about like how to reduce bias in AI, but how do you distinguish like what should be reduced? Like, for example, we have like a consensus on like anti-cannibalism and like the ones you mentioned, like sexism, racism, those ones present. But like, what about ones like vegetarianism or things that have multiple opinions or differing opinions? How do you decide which ones to like discount, which ones not to?
That's a very good question, and I think that, as you said, it will come with a consensus, and only networking and having that opinion from the different people that have the different opinions could lead to a potential solution on what to discard as a result. But the important thing is that we include everyone in the conversation. I think that's the main point, because if we subconsciously or consciously even say we're not going to include the vegetarians, you know, something like that, then you are already introducing bias into the decision making. So I don't have, I think my answer to that is it can be attained through conversation, the final decision of what are we going to include in the decision making process, if that makes sense. I'm sorry, it's a lot of redundant words in my answer.
Eduardo, I just want to say, really interesting presentation. My presentation on Thursday is sort of similar lines, but applications within healthcare and asthma diagnosis. But I had a question. I think Nicole kind of had a similar sentiment to what I was going to ask, but I'm curious about more on that vein is how do you determine that consensus? So for example, I know in some cultures, smiling, you know, in the Canadian culture, I guess, smiling is very much considered as, you know, you do it, you're friendly, you do it to everyone. Whereas I think in some other cultures, smiling is something that's really reserved for, you know, an intimate partner or like really close friends or family. And it's not something that you see very much commonly. So when we're looking at the data, obviously there's going to be variability between cultures, and that cultural bias is a really large piece to this. So how would we potentially, instead of looking at it as like, I'm sure there's a way to look at those data and factor in culture and create sort of an output, but is there a possibility to also look at this in the sense of like probabilities, because that output is never going to be 100% correct, because even within a culture there's a lot of variability. So could you maybe speak on the probability aspect of artificial intelligence and how that might potentially play into, you know, decision making?
I don't have the expertise to answer that, but I am assuming that, or I suspect that we could also take into account the geographical location. So imagine we developed an AI for the whole world to use about what face should you make if you want to make friends in a particular part of the world. You need to be like this, or you need to be like this, or like that. Imagine this is an example. Maybe if we also factor in where are you in the world, then we can have different answers that are appropriate for the specific context where you are. And again, it would be fantastic to have a data server that can collect all of this information to give us a better representation of reality. But I think it's complicated. And of course, ultimately, the answer would be the best probability that the algorithm decides this is the best chance that you will succeed. But of course, it may not be a successful solution, right? And we need to be aware of that and accept it, right? So, yeah, I think that's.
So particularly in Canada, we're multicultural, right? Even in a given part of a given city, right? Even if you take a certain neighborhood in Edmonton, you may have remarkably different beliefs amongst the people there and styles of interacting. So I agree with you that geography would be one clue, but it couldn't be the only one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No.
And I think that goes to your earlier point, Eduardo, that the richer the data, the more you're able to pull out of it. Like, it wouldn't just be geography, it'd probably be like socioeconomic status, cultural differences, like religion, race, gender, things like that. So
one thing, just as an aside, that I have noticed, if you think about the difference between the janitorial staff and me, since I moved into my current office, the janitor who comes in every night, he hasn't done anything bad, but like if I turn off all the lights, he will turn on one that sort of, intrigues him, or he'll turn on the wall screen or the lava lamp or something. So far, he hasn't done anything really strange, but he's the only suspect. And, things happen. I leave the office, everything off. I come back the next morning and there's stuff on. And yeah, so it is quite interesting to think of what can be allowed, right? So what could he do where I'd have to inform his supervisor, I have to push back. And then what would happen to me if I offend the janitor? And it all, yeah.
Maybe the singularity is already happening in your office. And it's not the janitor, it's an artificial intelligence system turning on the light, making you believe that it's another.
Yes. And you see, it gets more complicated by your cardboard cutouts, right? Like if your 3 cardboard cutouts are here in the office, and for instance, surrounding Rebecca's desk, how close can they get to the desk? What are the rules, right? These are things we haven't really decided. With what can be there, yeah. So there are all sorts of things that will be played out in this very office that have to do with these decisions.